On the edge of the small, dusty town of Echo Ridge, where the wind whipped the dry earth into swirling clouds, lived an elderly farmer named Caleb Riggs. Known for his quiet nature and humble ways, Caleb had long been the backbone of the community, tending to his farm and living a life free from trouble. That was until the Brown brothers, two notorious outlaws feared by many, set their sights on him. With their violent ways, they wanted Caleb's land, and they weren't going to take no for an answer. But Caleb wasn't the kind of man to fold so easily. His dogs, a group of fiercely loyal working dogs, had been his companions for years, and when the Brown brothers threatened his way of life, the dogs were ready to fight. What followed would bring down the criminal empire built on fear and intimidation, and bring peace to a town once on the edge of ruin. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because tomorrow we have a special story for you. Caleb Riggs had always prided himself on the quiet life he had built in the arid plains of Echo Ridge. His farm, though not grand, had been the land of his forefathers, passed down through generations of Riggs men who had worked the soil with nothing but grit and determination. The small, weathered farmhouse was a testament to that effort, a place filled with memories where his wife, Sarah, once walked, humming softly while she worked. But now, it was just Caleb, alone except for the company of his dogs. 4 loyal shepherds that had been with him through thick and thin. They were more than just animals to Caleb. They were family. And they had always been there when he needed them most, their sharp eyes and keen senses an extension of his own. The sun was beginning to set behind the distant hills as Caleb wiped the sweat from his brow, the day's work winding down as he made his way to the barn. His mind wandered to the days ahead. He would need to mend the fence that had been knocked over by a recent storm, and he'd have to restock on grain. Life had become a cycle of quiet work, but it was a life he had come to appreciate. It was simple, but it was his. But that peace was not meant to last. The first sign of trouble came when the dogs began barking. Sharp, high-pitched barks that signaled something was wrong. Caleb paused, his instincts kicking in. The dogs didn't bark like this unless there was a reason. His heart quickened as he hurried toward the back of the house, where the dogs had gathered, their eyes trained on something beyond the fence. Caleb squinted into the fading light, and there, riding toward his land, were 2 figures, dust swirling around them as they rode closer. His heart sank. He knew exactly who they were. The Brown brothers. The notorious outlaws had been causing trouble in Echo Ridge for months, robbing, intimidating, and extorting anyone who crossed their path. They had already taken land from the weaker farmers and settlers, but Caleb Riggs was not a man easily intimidated. He had worked too hard, fought too long to have his land taken away by men who thought they could bully him into submission. The dogs continued to growl, their muscles tensed as they circled Caleb protectively. Caleb looked at them, his mind racing. He was an old man now, past his prime, but he wasn't about to let these 2 men take what had been his for over 40 years. Not without a fight. The 2 outlaws dismounted at the edge of his property, one of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his face, tipped his hat back, revealing a cruel smile. Well, look what we got here, boys," the man said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Old Caleb Riggs, still hanging on to his little piece of dirt. "We've got plans for this place, Caleb. Real nice plans." Caleb stood tall, his posture rigid. The dogs were still at his side, their eyes locked on the men, and Caleb could feel their tension. He wasn't afraid, not in the traditional sense, but he knew the Brown brothers weren't the type to leave without bloodshed. These were men who got what they wanted by taking it, not asking for it. "I'm not selling and I'm not leaving," Caleb said, his voice steady but firm. "You can turn around and ride away now, or I'll make sure you regret it." The man with the scar chuckled darkly, his eyes flicking to the dogs before returning to Caleb. "I think you're forgetting your place, old man. This land's not yours anymore. Not if we want it. And we do. You're gonna give it up, or we'll take it from you. One way or another." Caleb's hand instinctively tightened around the small rifle he kept at his side for moments like this. But he didn't raise it. "Not yet. I'm not afraid of you," Caleb said, his voice unwavering. "And I'm not backing down. Not for you, not for anyone, the scarred man sneered, stepping forward, and the other man, shorter but stockier, moved toward Caleb's front gate. Caleb could hear their laughter, their jeers, as they slowly circled him, their movements deliberate, like wolves closing in on their prey. The dogs growled louder now, their eyes flashing in warning. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest, but he stood firm. He was alone, and these men had guns. But he had his dogs, smart, strong, and fiercely loyal. He had raised them from pups, trained them to guard his property, to keep what was his safe. And right now, they were as much a part of this fight as Caleb was. The scarred man stopped a few paces away, raising his hands in mock surrender. You really think those dogs are going to protect you? Old man, we've got guns, and you've got, what? Some mutts. Caleb's eyes never wavered. He stood, still as stone, his grip on the rifle tightening. They're more than mutts. They'll rip you to shreds if you try anything. The man laughed again, but it was a hollow, uneasy laugh. He was starting to feel the tension in the air. He had underestimated Caleb, and worse, he had underestimated the dogs. The moment he took another step forward, everything changed. With a single, sharp command from Caleb, the dogs surged forward, moving with a speed and precision that was terrifying. The scarred man barely had time to draw his revolver before the first dog, a massive Belgian Malinois named Duke, lunged at him, knocking the gun from his hand and dragging him to the ground. The second dog, a fierce border collie named Jessie, was already on the other man, her teeth sinking into his leg before he could even react. The men's shouts of surprise and pain filled the air, but Caleb remained unmoved, his eyes locked on the chaos unfolding before him. The Brown brothers had come to take what wasn't theirs, but they had underestimated the determination of an old man and the strength of the dogs that stood by him. Stay down, Caleb commanded, and the dogs, ever loyal, immediately backed off, standing guard as the men scrambled to their feet, their eyes wide with fear and disbelief. Caleb took a slow, measured step forward, his rifle steady in his hands. He wasn't going to let them take his land. Not now, not ever. You'll leave, or I'll make sure you regret coming here, Caleb said, his voice low and steady. The Brown brothers exchanged a quick look, their bravado slipping away as they realized they were no longer in control. With a final, angry growl from Duke, the men turned and scrambled for their horses, vanishing into the dust. Caleb stood, his heart still racing but his mind clear. He had won this battle, but there was more to come. He knew that. But for now, the land was his, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it without a fight. As the dust settled around the barnyard, Caleb Riggs stood silently, watching the Brown brothers scramble on horseback, fleeing his land. His breath came in short bursts, his heart still pounding in his chest. The dogs, Duke, Jessie, and the others, milled around him, their bodies still tense, ready for the next command. But Caleb knew it wasn't over. The Brown brothers may have fled, but they weren't going to give up so easily. Outlaws like them didn't let a defeat stop them. They were like rats, always coming back for more, no matter how many times they were chased off. As the sound of hooves faded into the distance, Caleb walked slowly back to the farmhouse, his boots crunching softly against the dry earth. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the land. It was peaceful now, but Caleb could feel the weight of what was coming next. His land, his livelihood, was still in jeopardy. He took a deep breath as he entered the barn, closing the door behind him with a soft creak. The dogs followed, their eyes still scanning the yard, their instincts alert for any sign of trouble. Caleb smiled at them, a faint warmth in his expression, but the smile didn't last long. He knew the Brown brothers wouldn't be gone for good. Caleb had seen men like them before, men who thought they could take what wasn't theirs through force and intimidation. They didn't know when to quit. But Caleb wasn't like the others they had terrorized. He had something they didn't: determination and a fierce protectiveness for the land that had been in his family for generations. The dogs had been his companions through every challenge, every storm, and they would stand by him now. The night passed quietly, the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves filling the air. Caleb rested lightly, his ear tuned to the sounds of the farm. The dogs lay close by, their bodies relaxed but their alertness never wavering. Caleb knew that at any moment, the Brown brothers could return with more men. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. Just before dawn, he was woken by the sound of a faint growl. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to rouse him from his half-sleep. He rose from his cot, pulling on his boots and grabbing his rifle from the corner of the room. He moved quietly toward the door, the dogs already at his side, their ears perked and their eyes sharp. Caleb opened the door just a crack, peering out into the morning light. There, on the edge of his property, were figures moving in the shadows. At least 3 men. He could tell by their silhouettes. They were riding low, trying to keep their presence hidden, but the dogs had already sensed them. "Stay here," Caleb whispered to the dogs, who obediently lowered to a crouch, their bodies tense. He stepped out onto the porch, his rifle ready, but not raised. He needed to know what they were planning. The men moved closer, their horses barely making a sound on the soft ground. Caleb could make out their faces now. 2 of them were familiar, from the Brown brothers' gang. The third man, however, was someone he didn't recognize. Caleb's grip on the rifle tightened, but he didn't make a move just yet. He wanted to hear what they had to say. "They've been warned. Twice," the stranger said, his voice low and gravelly. "We need to send a message. This land belongs to us now." "Riggs is a stubborn old fool," one of the Brown brothers spat. "That's the truth, all right, but we can't do it alone. We need more men. We'll come back, hit him hard, take the farm, his dogs, everything. But we need more firepower, more muscle." Caleb clenched his jaw. He could hear the plan formulating, their greedy intentions clear as day. They didn't care about the land. They wanted to break him. They wanted him to leave. And they were planning on coming back with reinforcements, bringing more trouble to his door. Without hesitation, Caleb signaled to his dogs. They had been trained for this moment, to fight, to protect, and to defend the land at all costs. He stepped forward, his rifle raised now, his voice steady and strong. "You've been warned already," he called out. "This land doesn't belong to you. And if you want it, you'll have to go through me and my dogs first." The men froze for a moment, surprised by Caleb's defiance. They hadn't expected him to confront them so directly. But that moment of hesitation was all the time Caleb needed. With a sharp whistle, he sent the dogs charging forward. Duke, Jesse, and the others moved like lightning, their powerful legs kicking up the dirt as they bounded toward the men. The Brown brothers reached for their guns, but they were too slow. Duke tackled the first man, knocking him to the ground, his teeth snapping with precision. Jesse was already on the second man, her jaws clamping onto his arm as he tried to draw his pistol. The third man, the stranger, hesitated. He had seen the dogs in action before, but he hadn't expected them to move so quickly. He didn't have time to react. Within seconds, one of the dogs had him by the leg, pulling him down off his horse and onto the ground. Caleb stepped forward, his rifle aimed but not fired. The outlaws were done. They had no chance. The dogs had already neutralized the threat. "Get up," Caleb said firmly to the man who had been knocked to the ground. He didn't look at the others. There was no need. The dogs had made sure they were out of the fight. The man struggled to his feet, fear in his eyes now. "We were just trying to—" "You were trying to take what's mine," Caleb interrupted, his voice low and steady. "And now you'll leave." The man glanced at the dogs, still circling him, their eyes locked onto him like predators. He knew he had no chance. He turned toward the others, who were still on the ground, nursing their wounds. "Get out of here," Caleb growled. "Before I change my mind." The man didn't need to be told twice. He turned and ran, scrambling to mount his horse, leaving the other 2 men behind. They followed quickly, limping as fast as they could. Caleb watched them go, his heart still pounding in his chest, but there was a sense of relief now. The dogs had once again proven their worth, and the land was safe, for now. As the sun began to rise higher, casting long shadows across the farm, Caleb turned back toward the house. He didn't know what the Brown brothers had planned next, but one thing was certain: they weren't going to get away with it. Not while he was still standing. And if they wanted his land, They would have to face the full force of Calabriggs and his dogs, because as long as he lived, he would fight to protect what was his, and he would do it with everything he had. The next few days passed in an uneasy silence. Calabriggs spent his time working the land, fixing fences, and keeping a watchful eye on the horizon. The dogs, Duke, Jesse, and the rest, never left his side. Their presence brought him comfort, but it also reminded him that the trouble wasn't over. The Brown brothers had left, but Caleb knew it wouldn't be long before they came back. The lawless men were determined to take his farm, and their retreat wasn't out of defeat. It was simply a temporary strategy to regroup, to come back stronger. The morning after the Brown brothers' retreat, Caleb had repaired the damage to the fence and was cleaning the barn when he heard it, a distant rumbling of horses. His hand instinctively went to the rifle leaning against the barn wall. He wasn't sure if it was the Brown brothers returning or just a stray rider passing through, but the sound of hooves drew his attention. His dogs immediately began barking, their hackles raised as they circled around him. Caleb held up his hand, signaling them to stay back, then slowly moved toward the front of the barn. The sound grew louder, and within minutes, the riders appeared. 5 of them this time, not 2. They were moving in a tight formation, their horses kicking up dust as they approached. Caleb's eyes narrowed. This time, it wasn't just the Brown brothers. It was a whole new crew, more men, more firepower. They were here to finish what had been started. As they neared, Caleb saw the lead rider, a man wearing a black hat and a long duster. His face was shadowed, but Caleb could see the rough look in his eyes, the kind of man who didn't take kindly to being told no. He could tell by the way the men moved, confident, arrogant, that they weren't here to negotiate. They were here to take. And Calabriggs had learned long ago that negotiating with men like these was a waste of breath. He didn't wait for them to make the first move. Not welcome here. Caleb shouted across the yard, his voice firm, carrying the weight of his resolve. This land's not for sale. You've already had your chance. The lead rider reined his horse in, a smirk on his face. He seemed to be savoring the moment, like a predator sizing up its prey. I don't recall asking for your permission, old man, he called back, his tone mocking. We're here to take what's ours. And that means your land, whether you like it or not. Caleb stepped forward, rifle still slung across his shoulder. His heart was steady, his stance unyielding. The dogs were on high alert now, their bodies tense, ready to move at a moment's notice. Caleb knew they were ready. They could feel the danger as much as he could. You'll have to get past me and my dogs first, Caleb said, his voice low but clear. And I'll warn you now, that's not going to be easy. The lead rider's smirk faded slightly, replaced by a hard glare. Dogs don't scare me. You're just an old fool trying to protect what doesn't belong to you. Caleb didn't respond. Instead, he nodded to his dogs. With a single command, they sprang into action. Duke, Jesse, and the others were faster than the men could react. In a blur of movement, they were on the Outlaws, moving with the kind of precision that only years of training could produce. One man's horse buckled as Jesse lunged, sinking her teeth into its flank and throwing him to the ground. Another outlaw barely had time to draw his revolver before Duke was on him, knocking him sideways and pinning him to the dirt with a force that left the man gasping for air. The lead rider reached for his gun, but Caleb's rifle was already up, aimed squarely at his chest. I warned you, Caleb said, his voice firm, not an ounce of fear in it. This land is mine, and you're not welcome here. The outlaw's hand trembled as he let go of his gun, his eyes flicking to the men around him. 2 of them had already been neutralized, the dogs having done their work with ruthless efficiency. The other 2 were still scrambling, trying to get their bearings after being knocked off their horses. They had no chance of escaping the dogs' fury. Caleb held his ground, the rifle steady in his hands. You're outnumbered, and you're outmatched. I won't ask again. The lead rider scowled, his eyes darkening with rage. But even he knew when the fight was over. He looked at the men who were still struggling to get up, and then back at Caleb. With a tight jaw, he gave a curt nod. This ain't over, old man, he spat, his voice low with menace. You can't fight this forever. You'll see. With that, he turned his horse, signaling the others to follow. The outlaws retreated, stumbling over each other in their haste to leave, and within moments, they were gone, riding off into the horizon, leaving Caleb and his dogs standing victorious on the land they had just protected. Caleb stood still for a moment, his breath steady as he watched the men retreat. His heart was still racing, but there was a deep sense of satisfaction settling over him. He had faced them down, not with threats, but with the strength of his resolve and the power of his dogs. The dogs circled around him, their bodies relaxed now that the threat had passed. Caleb looked down at them, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Good work, boys," he muttered, his hand reaching out to pat Duke on the head. He turned back to the farm, his mind already calculating the next steps. The Brown brothers would likely regroup. This wasn't over. Caleb knew they would return, and when they did, he would be ready. But for tonight, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The land was safe for now, and the outlaws had been sent packing. There was no better feeling than knowing his farm, and the life he had built, was still his. And as he made his way back to the house, he knew that whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone. The sun had barely risen the next morning when Caleb Riggs was already back at work. The previous day's confrontation with the Brown brothers left an unsettling weight in the air. Caleb's old bones ached, but his resolve was stronger than ever. He wasn't about to let his farm slip away, not without a fight. He had lived through worse times, and this land had been in his family for generations. It wasn't just the land itself that made Caleb fight. It was the way of life that came with it. No outlaws, no gang of thugs, were going to take that from him. The dogs, ever watchful, stood guard by the farmhouse as Caleb worked the fields. There was a rhythmic routine to it all. He wasn't as quick as he once was, but the quiet of the farm, the fresh air, and the company of his dogs kept him steady. It was a solitary existence, but it had been a peaceful one until now. Caleb wiped the sweat from his brow as he paused to rest against a fence post. The previous day had been a victory of sorts, but the outlaws hadn't been entirely defeated. They had fled, yes, but they hadn't given up. And Caleb knew that in the lawless world of the West, men like the Brown brothers didn't just go away. They regrouped, they planned, and they came back harder. He glanced toward the horizon. The dust from their retreat had long since settled, but the weight of what was to come loomed over him. The Brown brothers would be back, and Caleb had a feeling that when they did, they wouldn't come alone. A sharp bark broke his thoughts. Jesse, his clever border collie, had spotted something in the distance. Caleb straightened, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle, but he didn't draw it just yet. The dogs were already moving, alert, yet controlled. Through the haze of heat and dust, he saw them. For riders, moving at a slow pace, approaching his land. They weren't the same group that had fled yesterday. These men were different, older, slower, but there was something in the way they moved that made Caleb's pulse quicken. They were here for business. Caleb's grip on his rifle tightened. The dogs, sensing the tension, growled low in their throats, their muscles tensed. Jesse, ever the sharp-eyed leader, stood at his side, watching the riders as they came closer. Duke, a large and powerful Malinois, stood at the gate, his stance aggressive, his hackles raised. "Stay," Caleb whispered, his voice soft but firm. The dogs obeyed, but their eyes remained fixed on the approaching men. Caleb took a steady breath and stepped forward, not waiting for the riders to come to him. If these men were looking for trouble, they would find it waiting for them. The riders stopped just outside the fence, their eyes scanning the land. Caleb stood his ground, rifle slung over his shoulder, his gaze steady. The lead rider was older, with graying hair and a thick mustache that curled downward. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face, but Caleb could see the coldness in his eyes as they locked onto him. "We're looking for Caleb Riggs," the man called out, his voice rough, like he'd been chewing dirt all his life. His tone wasn't friendly, but it wasn't threatening, yet. "I'm Caleb Riggs," Caleb replied, his voice calm but firm. "And you're trespassing." The man smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's what I thought," he said. "You're the one who put up a fight yesterday. Thought you'd be dead by now. But I see you've got yourself a few friends." His eyes flicked to the dogs, and Caleb noticed the unease flicker in the man's gaze. "They're not my friends," Caleb said quietly. "They're my family." The man chuckled, but it was a hollow, mirthless sound. "Family, huh? Well, you've got yourself a nice little setup here, Riggs. But we're here to make sure you understand something. You're not in charge here. Not anymore. I don't take orders from men like you," Caleb responded. The rider's eyes hardened, and he motioned to his men, who dismounted and moved forward, their hands resting on their guns, eyes scanning the area. Caleb could see the tension in their posture, their hands ready to pull, but waiting for the signal. Caleb's dogs growled in unison, low and threatening. Jessie stepped forward, her eyes locked onto the man who had taken a step too close. The other dogs remained in place, but Caleb could feel the energy rising in the air. The dogs were ready, and so was he. "Why don't you just go back to town?" Caleb said, his voice unshaken. "I don't want trouble." "Too late for that," the lead rider said, his eyes narrowing. "You're not going anywhere, Riggs. This land belongs to us now, and you'll leave or we'll make you." The moment the rider spoke those words, Caleb knew this wasn't just about land anymore. This was about intimidation. This was about breaking him. They thought they could scare him into submission, but they hadn't considered one thing. Caleb had never been the kind of man to back down. Not in battle, not in life, and certainly not now. He stood tall, his grip on the rifle steady as his dogs, sensing the tension, moved forward in unison. Jessie was the first to spring, her powerful legs propelling her toward the nearest outlaw, knocking him to the ground with a swift attack. Duke was on another man in an instant, his jaws sinking into the man's arm before he could draw his gun. The men stumbled back, taken by surprise, their eyes wide with shock as the dogs swiftly incapacitated them. Caleb didn't waste a moment. With one quick motion, he brought his rifle up, aiming directly at the lead rider. The outlaw froze, realizing too late that this old farmer wasn't the easy target they had expected. "Leave. Now," Caleb said, his voice low and steady. The man swallowed hard, his bravado fading as he glanced at the chaos unfolding around him. He turned to his men, but they were already retreating, either held back by the dogs or too afraid to fight any longer. The lead rider backed away slowly, holding his hands up in surrender. "You won't be left alone, Riggs," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "This is just a warning. You'll see us again." Caleb didn't reply. He simply nodded to his dogs, signaling them to stand down. As the last of the men retreated, Caleb felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The dogs had once again proven their worth, keeping him and his farm safe. But this wasn't the end. The Brown brothers would be back, that much was certain. But Caleb wasn't afraid. He had his dogs, and with them, he would protect his land, no matter who came to take it. As the riders disappeared into the distance, Caleb returned to the farmhouse, his heart steady once more. The land was still his, and as long as he lived, no one was going to take it from him. The following days were tense in Echo Ridge. Caleb Riggs had already fought off one group of outlaws and sent them scurrying back to their hole, but the Brown brothers were a different breed. These men weren't easily discouraged, and Caleb knew deep in his gut that it was only a matter of time before they returned, angrier and more determined than ever. The dogs were always at his side now, their instincts honed, their watchful eyes never straying too far from the horizon. Caleb kept to his routine, doing the work that needed to be done on the farm. But every moment, he felt the weight of the threat hanging over him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the Brown brothers were only the tip of the iceberg. Whoever was behind them, whoever was orchestrating their harassment, had to be a force far more powerful than a couple of outlaws looking to take a piece of land. Caleb had never been one to trust easily. His life had been hard enough, and the years had taught him the value of caution. He trusted his dogs more than anyone. They had never let him down. But even with them by his side, he felt a gnawing uncertainty. Could they really keep the farm safe? Could he hold off an empire that seemed to grow stronger with every passing day? It was on the fourth day after the Brown brothers' retreat that the trouble finally arrived. It started just before sundown, the time when the long shadows of the day stretched across the farm. Caleb had just finished milking the cows when he heard it, distant voices, Men. Not the same men from before, but close enough. The sound of hooves followed soon after, and this time, there were more than just 4 riders. The hooves were closer. Caleb's heart dropped, and his dogs began to bark, their growls sharper and more urgent. He didn't need to waste time thinking. He grabbed his rifle and hurried outside, his eyes scanning the horizon. The dogs had already positioned themselves at the perimeter of the farm, their attention focused on the approaching riders. Caleb's pulse quickened, but his mind was clear. He had been waiting for this. The Brown brothers wouldn't give up easily, and now they had brought reinforcements. The riders came into view. A half-dozen men this time, all of them armed and moving with purpose. Caleb's eyes narrowed as they rode onto his land, stopping just short of the front gate. The leader of the group was a tall man with a narrow face, his eyes dark and cold, his clothes stiff with the look of someone who had seen too much violence. Caleb recognized him immediately, a notorious gunman by the name of Frank Morgan. He had been an associate of the Brown brothers for years, a hired gun who had gained a reputation for being ruthlessly efficient. "Afternoon, Riggs," Morgan called out, tipping his hat back and grinning. "Heard you've been causing some trouble." "I don't want any trouble, Morgan," Caleb said, his voice steady but with a noticeable edge. He wasn't about to let these men take control of the conversation. "You're trespassing. You've already been told this land's not for sale," Morgan chuckled, his gaze sweeping over the farm as if it were already his. "You're a stubborn one, Riggs. But you're about to learn something. This land's already been promised to someone with more power than you. You're not going to win this fight." Caleb's heart beat faster. This was it, the moment he had feared. These men weren't here just to steal his land. They were here to send a message. They had the backing of someone far bigger than themselves, someone who had the power to destroy Caleb if they wanted to. But Caleb wasn't going to give up that easily. He stepped forward, his rifle resting across his shoulder, but his stance firm. "I'm not leaving. And neither are you." Morgan's grin widened. "You think your dogs are going to stop us? You're mistaken, old man. We've got the muscle. You've got a few mutts." Without missing a beat, Caleb stepped aside, giving the signal to his dogs. At the sound of his command, they surged forward, their bodies moving like shadows. The lead dog, Duke, was the first to approach Morgan's horse, barking sharply. The horse reared back in surprise, but Duke was too quick. In one fluid motion, Duke lunged, biting into the horse's rein, throwing the animal into a frenzy. Morgan cursed loudly as his horse bucked and tried to break free. The other men fumbled for their weapons, but Jessie was already on them. The border collie darted forward, her teeth snapping in the air, forcing the men to back off. The dogs were fast, their training flawless, and they were moving with a precision that took the outlaws by surprise. Jessie circled one of the men, her growl steady as she kept him at bay, while Duke took down another by leaping onto his back and knocking him to the ground. The remaining outlaws tried to draw their guns, but the dogs were faster. One of them, a wiry man with a thick mustache, barely got his pistol out before he was tackled by the largest of the dogs, a German shepherd named Max. The man's scream was short-lived as Max's powerful jaws clamped down on his arm, disarming him in an instant. Morgan, seeing his men being overpowered by the dogs, tried to regain control, drawing his revolver with shaking hands. "Stop them," he shouted. "Shoot the damn dogs." But Caleb was ready. He had seen this before, the desperation in the eyes of men who realized they had no control left. Without hesitation, Caleb raised his rifle and took aim, firing a warning shot just above Morgan's head. The bullet whizzed by, the noise deafening in the stillness of the morning. Morgan froze, his hand still gripping his revolver. He glanced around at the chaos. The dogs had taken down 2 more men, and the rest of his crew was on the ground, struggling to free themselves from the dogs' relentless hold. He knew they were losing, and quickly. Caleb stepped forward, his rifle now aimed directly at Morgan. "I warned you," Caleb said, his voice low, filled with authority. "This is my land, and I don't take kindly to men like you trying to steal it." Morgan's expression twisted in frustration, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable now. He knew he had lost. With a growl of anger, he waved to his men, signaling them to retreat. The remaining outlaws, bruised and battered, scrambled to mount their horses, but the dogs didn't let up. They pursued them for several hundred yards, keeping them on the run, their barks echoing in the distance until the last rider disappeared over the hills. Caleb stood still, rifle in hand, watching them go. His dogs circled him, their bodies still tense, but their eyes relaxed now that the fight was over. Caleb looked down at them, a wave of pride swelling in his chest. "Good work, boys," he muttered, his voice thick with gratitude. The dogs wagged their tails, their loyalty unwavering. But Caleb knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Morgan and his men would be back, and they wouldn't come unprepared next time. Caleb's land, his farm, was still in danger. But now, he had the upper hand. He had the dogs, the land, and the will to fight for both. The Brown brothers, Morgan, and whoever else was pulling the strings, they would find out that Caleb Riggs wasn't just an old man. He was a man of resolve, a man who would defend his land with every breath in his body. And for as long as he stood on that soil, no one would take it from him. The quiet that settled over Caleb Riggs' farm after the confrontation with Morgan and his men was short-lived. The wind still whispered across the dry earth. The dogs still kept a watchful eye on the horizon, but Caleb could feel it. Things were changing. His victory was fleeting, and the threats were only going to get more intense. The Brown brothers weren't the only ones with designs on his land. Caleb could sense something bigger was looming, something more insidious. The following morning, he went about his usual routine, checking on the livestock, repairing the barn, and keeping a close eye on his crops. But his thoughts were often distracted by the danger that still lingered. The Brown brothers had left, but they wouldn't stop. And Morgan, he was a new threat, one Caleb had to keep an eye on. The man was not only a gunman, but from the way he commanded his men, Caleb suspected that Morgan wasn't acting alone. There had to be someone pulling the strings, someone bigger. As he worked, Caleb kept his eyes on the distant hills, always watching for movement. He wasn't afraid. He'd never been a man to shrink from a fight, but he knew the stakes were getting higher. This wasn't just about defending his farm anymore. This was about protecting his home, his way of life, from a growing web of corruption and violence. Around noon, as Caleb was working on the fence line, the dogs suddenly became agitated. They barked wildly, their bodies tense, eyes fixed on the distant horizon. Caleb stood up slowly, wiping the sweat from his brow as he scanned the landscape. He couldn't see anything yet, but the dogs were on edge. Something was coming. He didn't wait for it to get any closer. The dogs were already moving into position, their sharp senses catching every change in the air. Caleb, rifle in hand, made his way back to the house, scanning the horizon with a practiced eye. It wasn't long before he spotted them, riders, coming up the dirt road toward his farm, moving with a determined pace. This wasn't just a group of outlaws. There were more of them now, at least 10 riders, moving with the kind of discipline that suggested they were more than just a gang of thieves. The leader, a tall man with a weathered face and cold, calculating eyes, rode ahead of the others. He was wearing a long coat, and his hat was tipped low, casting a shadow over his face. Caleb's heart skipped a beat. This man wasn't just anyone. He recognized him. This was the man who had been pulling the strings behind the Brown brothers, Francis King, a man with a reputation that stretched across the West. A former lawman turned bounty hunter, King was known for his ruthless efficiency and cold, methodical approach to getting what he wanted. And what he wanted, Caleb knew, was land. His land. The dogs had already begun to circle, growling low, their eyes never leaving the riders. Caleb stood tall, his rifle at the ready, but he wasn't going to rush this. He had learned long ago that in moments like this, patience was key. The dogs were ready, and he had the advantage of knowing his land better than anyone. King and his men didn't stop at the edge of Caleb's farm. They kept coming, riding right up to the front gate with no hesitation. As they dismounted, the dogs growled more fiercely, their bodies tense with anticipation. Caleb could see the fear flicker in the eyes of the riders. They hadn't expected such resistance. "Riggs," King called out, his voice carrying across the yard, smooth and cold. "I've heard a lot about you. You're a stubborn old man, aren't you?" Thought you could stand in the way of progress. Well, I'm here to make sure you understand that this land doesn't belong to you anymore." Caleb stood his ground, rifle still resting against his shoulder. "You can't take it from me," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. "Not without a fight." King smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. He motioned to the other riders, who slowly began to form a circle around Caleb's house. "I don't need to fight you, Riggs. You're just one man. A stubborn, old man. You're outnumbered. You're outclassed." Caleb's heart beat steady. He wasn't intimidated. The dogs were already positioned around the perimeter of the farm, ready to strike. Caleb had trained them for moments like this, when intimidation and threats wouldn't work, when the only choice was to stand his ground and let his actions speak for themselves. "You'll leave," Caleb said, his voice steady. "And if you don't, you'll see what these dogs can do." King raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Dogs, huh? You think your mutts can stop me?" "They're more than mutts," Caleb replied, his voice growing cold. "They're the best trained working dogs you'll ever face. And they'll rip you to pieces if you try to take what's mine." With a sudden signal from Caleb, the dogs sprang into action. Jesse, Duke, and the others moved like lightning, their bodies fluid and fast. They charged toward the riders, knocking one man off his horse and tackling another before he could even reach for his gun. King's men scrambled, trying to draw their weapons, but the dogs were too fast, too precise. The lead rider, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, reached for his revolver, but Duke was already on him. The massive dog lunged, knocking him to the ground, and the man screamed in panic as Duke's powerful jaws clamped down on his arm, disarming him in seconds. Jesse was already on another rider, knocking him from his horse and pinning him to the dirt with ease. King, seeing the chaos unfold around him, drew his gun and aimed it at Caleb, but before he could pull the trigger, Duke was upon him. The dog lunged, knocking King off his horse and sending him sprawling onto the ground. Caleb watched as King struggled to regain his footing, but the dogs were relentless, circling him, their eyes locked on their prey. King's eyes filled with panic now. He had underestimated Caleb, and he had underestimated the dogs. "This is your last chance," Caleb said, his rifle raised, but not yet fired. "Leave now, and I'll let you walk away. But if you stay, I'll make sure you don't leave with anything." King swallowed hard, his gun still in hand, but his body language gave him away. He was scared. Caleb had the upper hand, and they knew it. Slowly, King lowered his weapon. The fight drained from him as he raised his hands in surrender. "I'm not going to ask again," Caleb said, his voice hard. "Get off my land." With that, King motioned to his men, who reluctantly backed away. The Brown brothers and their reinforcements had been defeated, their attempt to take Caleb's farm foiled by his dogs and his unshakable resolve. Slowly, they mounted their horses and rode off, disappearing into the horizon. Caleb watched them go, his heart still pounding, but a sense of relief washing over him. He had won again. The land was still his. The dogs had proven their worth once more, keeping him safe from the forces that sought to take it all. As the last of the riders disappeared, Caleb turned back to his farm, his dogs at his side. He knew this battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but he was ready. With his dogs and his will to protect what was his, Caleb Riggs knew he would never back down. The land was his, and no one, no outlaw, no criminal empire, would ever take it from him. The days after the second confrontation felt both heavy and oddly still. Caleb Riggs had fought off the Brown brothers and their reinforcements, and for now, his farm stood undisturbed. But Caleb could feel the storm on the horizon. The Brown brothers hadn't given up on taking what they thought was theirs, and they wouldn't stop until they got it. His farm was small, but it was one of the last untouched pieces of land in the area, untouched, except by those who wanted to exploit it for profit. Caleb spent his days working, but his thoughts were never far from the danger that lurked. His dogs were more than just companions. They were the only things standing between him and those who would take it all. Duke, Jesse, and the others were always by his side, loyal, trained, and prepared for whatever might come. He had hoped for peace, but deep down, he knew that this wasn't just about land anymore. The Brown brothers were pawns in a much larger game, one that Caleb had only begun to understand. The Outlaws were tied to someone bigger, someone with the power to control not just the land, but the law itself. And until Caleb figured out who was behind them, the fight would never be truly over. The following week, Caleb was once again walking the perimeter of his farm when he noticed something strange. There were no signs of movement, no approaching riders, but the stillness was unsettling. The dogs, too, were quiet, unusually so. Duke sat close by, his eyes scanning the horizon, while Jesse paced restlessly. Caleb frowned. It wasn't like the dogs to be this alert without a reason. His hand went instinctively to the rifle at his side. Something was wrong. Then, he heard it, distant, faint at first, but unmistakable. The rumble of hooves. Caleb's heart skipped. He knew the sound too well. The Brown brothers were back. But this time, there were more than just a few riders. The sound of hooves grew louder, the pounding rhythm of horses moving quickly toward his land. Caleb turned to the dogs, his eyes meeting Duke's, and without a word, the dogs sprang into action, moving ahead of him, positioning themselves along the perimeter. Caleb walked slowly back toward the house, his eyes never leaving the approaching riders. This time, it was different. There was something in the air, something colder than before. As the riders came into view, Caleb saw the leader. This time, it wasn't Morgan, the man from before. This man was taller, more imposing, with a thick beard that gave him a savage look. His eyes were cold, calculating. He wore a long coat and a black hat, much like the others, but there was an air of authority about him. Caleb knew immediately that this was someone with more power than the men who had come before. The riders were moving in a tight formation, and there were a dozen of them. Caleb could see the gleam of rifles and revolvers as they approached. They had come prepared for a fight, and this time, they weren't backing down. Caleb stood his ground, his rifle ready, his heart steady. He wasn't sure who these men were, but he could feel the threat in their every move. The dogs had already positioned themselves, ready to defend, but Caleb knew he couldn't rely solely on them this time. This wasn't just a raid. This was an invasion. The leader raised his hand as they neared the gate, signaling his men to stop. Caleb didn't move, his eyes locked onto the man. He was taller than Morgan, with a commanding presence that set him apart from the others. "You must be Caleb Riggs," the man said, his voice low and commanding. "I've heard a lot about you. A stubborn old man who thinks he can stand in the way of progress." "I don't care about progress," Caleb replied, his voice steady, even as his mind raced. "I care about my land, and I'm not going to let you take it." The man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, like a predator sizing up its prey. "You misunderstand, Riggs. You don't have a choice. This land is going to be ours, and you're either going to leave on your own, or we'll make you leave." Caleb didn't flinch. He had heard threats like this before, and he had fought against them. He wasn't going to let this man, whoever he was, take control of his farm. Not without a fight. "You'll have to get through me," Caleb said, his grip tightening on the rifle. "And my dogs." The man's eyes flicked toward the dogs, who were now in position, their bodies tense and their eyes locked on the riders. But the man wasn't intimidated. He simply nodded to his men, who began to dismount. "You're a brave man, Riggs. But you're an old man," the leader said. "You fought well so far, but you're out of your depth now. We're not here to negotiate." With that, the first of the riders drew his revolver and took aim at one of the dogs. But before he could fire, Caleb shouted, "Stay." The dog, a large shepherd named Max, immediately dropped to the ground, rolling to avoid the shot. Jessie, quick as lightning, charged forward, her teeth snapping at the man's wrist, causing him to drop the revolver with a scream of pain. The other men hesitated. They hadn't expected the dogs to be this aggressive, this quick. But Caleb didn't wait. With a single motion, he raised his rifle and fired a warning shot in the air, the blast loud and echoing in the stillness of the morning. "I warned you," Caleb said, his voice hard. "This is my land, and I won't let you take it." The leader looked back at his men, his face hardening. "Hold them off," he ordered. "We'll take this old fool down, one way or another." The dogs moved with terrifying precision, each one targeting a rider. Duke and Max quickly brought down one of the outlaws, knocking him to the ground and keeping him pinned there, while Jesse darted around another, biting at his ankles and causing him to lose his balance. The remaining riders tried to fight back, drawing their guns, but it was too late. The dogs were relentless, their movements too fast, too calculated. One by one, the outlaws were disarmed, their guns taken from them before they could get a shot off. The leader's face twisted in frustration and disbelief as he tried to back away, but Caleb stepped forward, his rifle still raised. "You've lost," Caleb said, his voice cold and final. "You and your men. Leave now, or I'll have my dogs do more than just disarm you." The leader swallowed hard, his eyes flicking nervously to the men around him. He knew they were beaten. The dogs had shown their strength, and Caleb had shown his resolve. Slowly, he raised his hands in surrender. "We'll leave," he said, his voice strained. "But this isn't over, Riggs. We'll be back." Caleb didn't respond. He didn't need to. The outlaws, broken and disarmed, began to retreat, their heads down in defeat. The dogs followed them for a while, keeping them on the run, before finally returning to Caleb's side. As the last rider disappeared into the distance, Caleb lowered his rifle. He turned to the dogs, pride swelling in his chest as they circled him, their eyes still alert but their bodies calm. They had defended the farm once again, and Caleb knew they were ready for whatever came next. He looked out over his land, the farm that had been in his family for generations. It was still his, and he would protect it with everything he had. The Brown brothers, Morgan, King, they might come again, but Caleb Riggs wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The days following the battle were strangely quiet, like the calm before the storm. Caleb Riggs stood on his porch, watching as the last of the outlaws retreated, disappearing into the horizon with their tails between their legs. The dogs stood beside him, their bodies relaxed but their eyes never straying too far from the distance. Caleb's farm, his land, was still his, thanks to the loyalty of his dogs and his unyielding determination to protect what was his. But as the sun began to set, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that this was just a brief respite. The Brown brothers, Frank Morgan, and now King's men, these were not just small-time outlaws. These were part of something bigger, something more dangerous. Whoever was behind them wasn't just interested in a little land grab. They wanted control. And Caleb Riggs wasn't going to be the one to hand it over. He spent the next few days doing what he did best, working the land. But as he mended the broken fences, tended to the animals, and checked the crops, his thoughts kept returning to the men he had faced. He had fought them off once, but would they return? And when they did, would they be prepared? He wasn't sure how much longer he could stand alone against a growing criminal empire. He needed to know who was behind all of this. The dogs kept a constant vigil, and Caleb often found himself grateful for their presence, for their sharp senses and unshakable loyalty. But the more he thought about the threats, the more he realized that he couldn't do this alone forever. His old bones weren't what they used to be, and while the dogs were strong, they weren't invincible. One evening, as Caleb walked along the creek near the edge of his property, deep in thought, he heard the familiar sound of hooves approaching. His heart skipped a beat. This time, there was no growl from the dogs. The animals were already in position, their bodies tense and alert, their eyes scanning the distance. Caleb stopped in his tracks, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. But this time, it wasn't an outlaw gang. As the riders drew closer, Caleb's heart dropped. These weren't the Brown brothers or Frank Morgan. These were familiar faces, faces he hadn't seen in years. He saw the dust rise ahead, a single rider leading a small group, and as the rider came into view, Caleb's pulse quickened. It was his brother, Daniel Riggs, a man he hadn't heard from in over a decade. The last time Caleb had seen him, Daniel had ridden off, leaving the family farm behind. He had gone to seek his fortune in the bigger cities, but Caleb hadn't expected him to return like this. Daniel wasn't alone. Behind him, a few other riders followed. They were dressed in the typical rough garb of bounty hunters, their faces hard and their eyes shaded beneath the wide brims of their hats. These men didn't look like the kind of folk Caleb trusted, but he couldn't make sense of it all. His brother was here, but why? Caleb, Daniel called, his voice carrying on the wind. I need to talk to you. Caleb's grip on his rifle loosened slightly, but he didn't lower it. There was too much at stake, and too many questions. What brings you back, Daniel? Thought you'd gone and forgotten about this place. Daniel halted his horse, dismounting with a grim look on his face. I didn't come back for a visit, he said. I came back to help. There's been talk, rumors, that the Brown brothers and a man named Frank Morgan have been running a racket in this area. But there's something bigger at play. I didn't come alone, Caleb. He glanced back at the men who had followed him, then returned his gaze to his brother. Caleb's eyes narrowed. You brought bounty hunters? Why? Because this isn't just a land grab anymore, Daniel replied, his voice low, urgent. There's a criminal syndicate involved, bigger than the Brown brothers. I've been tracking them for weeks. They're organized, much more than just a gang. They've got ties to politicians, lawmen, even businessmen. They've been expanding their reach, and now they're after you. The weight of Daniel's words hit Caleb like a blow to the gut. A syndicate. His land was just the beginning, the first piece of their larger plan. Caleb didn't need to be told twice. He understood what was at stake now. This wasn't just about defending his home anymore. It was about stopping a network of corruption that was poisoning the entire region. And what do you want me to do about it? Caleb asked, his voice tight. I'm just one old man with a few dogs. Daniel stepped closer, his face grim. You've got more than that, Caleb. You've got the land. You've got the dogs. And you've got me. I've got a few men on my side, too. But it's going to take all of us to take down what they've built. The realization hit Caleb hard. His brother had returned not just as family, but as a man who understood the true gravity of the situation. Daniel had seen the corruption, the evil that these men had been spreading, and he had come to bring it down. Caleb hadn't expected this. He hadn't wanted it. But he understood now, this was bigger than him, bigger than the farm. He lowered his rifle, his eyes meeting Daniel's. All right, but if we're going to fight, we fight together. And it's going to be on my terms. Daniel nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. That's the Caleb Riggs I know. We'll do it your way then. With that, the two men set about planning, speaking quietly as the bounty hunters, still perched on their horses, watched from a distance. Caleb didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. And that made all the difference. Over the next few days, Caleb and Daniel set to work. The bounty hunters, 3 in total, were seasoned men who had worked with Daniel in the past. They had connections, information, and the will to see this thing through. Caleb's dogs, still as loyal as ever, remained on high alert, and Caleb had never felt more grateful for their sharp instincts. His land, his home, was about to be the battleground for something much larger than he had ever expected. The game had changed. It wasn't just about surviving the next attack. It was about taking the fight to those who had been pulling the strings from the shadows. And Caleb Riggs, with his brother by his side and his dogs at his back, was ready to take them down, once and for all. The wind was sharper now, biting with the cold edge of a storm on the horizon. Caleb Riggs stood at the edge of his land, watching as his brother Daniel and the bounty hunters moved quietly through the fields, preparing for what would come next. It felt like the calm before a violent squall, the kind of storm that stripped everything bare. Caleb wasn't the kind of man who was used to working with others, especially not strangers or hired guns. But the stakes had changed. The threat was no longer just a handful of outlaws. It was an organized criminal empire that had wrapped itself into every corner of the West. And Caleb knew better than anyone that if he didn't stand now, everything he had fought for, everything he'd worked for, would be lost. The dogs were still restless, their instincts sharp, as if they, too, sensed the danger that was coming. Jessie stood at Caleb's side, her eyes scanning the horizon, while Duke and the others kept their watch further down the property. Caleb trusted them more than anyone. They were his first line of defense, and they would fight beside him until the end. Daniel approached, his eyes grave, his voice quieter than usual. I've got word from my men, he said, lowering his voice to ensure they weren't overheard. We've got a lead on where they're holed up. There's a ranch up in the hills, a few miles from here. That's where they've been meeting, where they've been planning their moves. Caleb nodded, his eyes narrowing. And you're sure about this? Daniel didn't hesitate. As sure as I can be. We've got a few allies in town who've been feeding us information. They don't know everything, but they've pointed us in the right direction. Caleb's mind raced. If they could take down the heart of the syndicate, if they could strike at the core of the operation, they could cripple their hold over the land. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever was. But Caleb wasn't afraid. Not anymore. We move tonight, Caleb said, his voice firm, his decision final. Daniel raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. You don't want to wait until morning? There's no time, Caleb replied. We know they're planning something. They won't give us another chance. Daniel nodded, his face hardening with determination. He wasn't the same man who had left this land years ago. He had been hardened by what he had seen in the world beyond Echo Ridge, and now he was back, ready to fight for what was his. The two men spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. Caleb packed supplies, checking his rifle one last time, and going over the plan with Daniel. They would need to move quickly, strike before the men knew what was happening. Caleb's dogs were an advantage. No one could match their speed and instincts. They would be the eyes and ears, helping the bounty hunters navigate through the dark and ensuring that they wouldn't be caught by surprise. The last of the sun dipped below the hills as Caleb mounted his horse, the familiar weight of his rifle against his shoulder, his dogs close behind. Daniel rode alongside him, his expression grim but resolute. As they rode toward the hills, the cold air bit at their faces, the distant stars beginning to twinkle above them. Caleb's thoughts were sharp, focused entirely on the task ahead. They couldn't afford mistakes. They couldn't afford to hesitate. Every man involved in the syndicate had to be taken down, every link in the chain severed. This was their only chance to reclaim the land, to bring peace back to the community. They reached the outskirts of the ranch just as the last of the daylight disappeared, leaving the world in darkness. The dogs' keen eyes scanned the area, their senses alert for any signs of movement. They could smell the danger, sense the presence of the men inside the ranch. Caleb and Daniel dismounted, signaling the dogs to stay close as they moved toward the ranch house. The sound of horses and low voices reached their ears. Caleb's grip tightened around his rifle as they crouched behind a small rise in the land, waiting. The bounty hunters positioned themselves further out, making sure they had a clear view of the entrance, while Caleb and Daniel waited for the right moment to strike. There's about 6 men inside, Daniel whispered, his eyes scanning the ranch house through the binoculars. We'll need to move fast. The front door's the easiest way in. The dogs will flush them out, and then we can go in. Caleb nodded. Let's go. Without another word, Caleb signaled the dogs. Jesse, Duke, and the others moved like shadows, darting toward the house with incredible speed. The outlaws inside didn't see them coming. By the time the first shot was fired, the dogs had already begun to attack, their teeth sinking into the legs of the men as they tried to grab their guns. Caleb and Daniel moved quickly, their rifles raised. The dogs had already neutralized 2 of the outlaws, their sharp teeth and agility keeping them off balance. The remaining men tried to fight back, but the dogs were too fast, too coordinated. One of the outlaws managed to draw his revolver, firing off a wild shot that missed by a wide margin. But before he could take another shot, Jessie lunged, knocking him to the ground and disarming him with a swift swipe of her paw. Duke was already on another man, pinning him to the ground with a force that knocked the breath out of him. The remaining outlaws had no chance. They had come to take what wasn't theirs, but Caleb Riggs, with his dogs and his brother by his side, wasn't about to let that happen. By the time the last of the outlaws had been taken down, the ranch was silent. Caleb stood amidst the chaos, his heart still pounding in his chest, but the victory was his. The dogs were circling, making sure the area was clear. Caleb's rifle was still raised, but the danger had passed, for now. Daniel moved up to his side, his face grim but relieved. It's over. We've taken down their operation here. But there's more, Caleb. There's always more. Caleb nodded. He knew that the syndicate was much larger than the group they had just taken down. But this was a start. They had struck a major blow, and the men behind this empire, whoever they were, would have to rethink their plans. They had underestimated Caleb Riggs, just like so many others had before. "We've won this round," Caleb said, his voice steady. "But there's still work to be done." "We're not done yet." Daniel clapped him on the shoulder, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You've got a lot of fight left in you, old man, and I've got your back. We'll finish this together." As the dogs circled around them, their work done, Caleb looked out over the ranch, his heart filled with a mix of pride and determination. The land was still his, and no empire, no criminal syndicate, would take it from him. They had taken the first step toward peace, but Caleb knew the road ahead would be long and full of more challenges. But he wasn't afraid. With his brother by his side, his dogs at his back, and his unbreakable will, Caleb Riggs was ready for whatever came next. The morning after the raid on the ranch, Caleb Riggs stood outside the farmhouse, watching the sun rise over the hills. The faint glow of orange and pink lighted the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. It was a new day, and though the night had been a hard-won victory, the battle was far from over. Caleb knew better than to think this would end with just one fight. The syndicate, whoever was pulling the strings, would retaliate. They always did. The dogs lay quietly at his feet, their bodies resting but their eyes still watchful. Jesse, Duke, and the others had earned their rest after the chaos of the night. They had proven their worth once again, protecting Caleb's farm, keeping the land safe from those who would destroy it. Caleb stroked Jesse's head gently, her fur soft beneath his calloused hand, and felt a brief moment of peace. He had fought for this, for his home, his family, and the life he had built here. But there was more to do. Daniel approached, his footsteps soft on the dry ground. He had been going over the events of the previous night with the bounty hunters, making sure they had all the information they needed. Caleb turned to face his brother, the weight of what was ahead settling in his chest. They had won, but the war wasn't over. "We've got some names," Daniel said, his voice quieter than usual. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small notebook, flipping it open. "There's a man named Henry Carrington. He's the one behind the syndicate, the one who's been pulling all the strings. He's got connections everywhere, lawmen, businessmen, and even a few politicians in Santa Fe." Caleb felt a cold shiver run through him. He had known there was someone bigger behind the Brown brothers and the other outlaws, but hearing the name Carrington made it all feel far more real, far more dangerous. Carrington was no ordinary man. He was someone with power, with reach, and with the resources to crush anyone who stood in his way. Daniel paused, looking Caleb in the eye. "We're going to need more help. We can't do this alone. Not if we want to take him down." Caleb nodded. "I don't trust many people, but if we're going to stop Carrington, we'll need to move fast. We can't let him get a foothold here." The two brothers stood in silence for a moment, the gravity of their situation settling over them. Caleb's farm, the land he had fought for, was still in danger. Carrington had deep pockets, and his influence reached further than Caleb had ever imagined. The Brown brothers had been nothing more than pawns, mere pieces on a much larger chessboard. "We'll need allies," Daniel said, breaking the silence. "I know a few men in Santa Fe, lawmen, bounty hunters, people who hate Carrington as much as we do. But it's going to take time to get them on our side." "Time we don't have," Caleb replied, his voice steady. "We don't wait. We move now. We've already put a dent in Carrington's operation. Let's keep the pressure on." Daniel gave him a sharp nod. "All right. We move out at sundown. We'll gather what we can, make our plan, and strike fast. If we can hit Carrington where it hurts, his supply lines, his men, he won't be able to recover. But it's going to take everything we've got." Caleb looked toward the hills, the vast open land that had been his family's for generations. He could feel the weight of the decision. This wasn't just about his land anymore. This was about stopping a man who wanted to take control of everything. And Caleb wasn't going to let that happen. "We won't let him win," Caleb said, his voice filled with certainty. "Not as long as I'm standing." As the day wore on, Caleb and Daniel worked with the bounty hunters to gather more information. They would strike Carrington's operation quickly, before he could regroup. Every piece of intel, every lead they could gather, would be used against him. They had the element of surprise on their side. By the time the sun began to set, Caleb and Daniel mounted their horses, the dogs beside them, their eyes gleaming with determination. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about taking the fight to Carrington, about hitting him hard and fast before he had a chance to recover. As they rode through the darkening landscape, Caleb couldn't help but think of the cost. This fight wasn't just about land. It was about the future. And he wasn't going to let Carrington's empire swallow everything he had fought for. This was his land, his home, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it from him without a fight. When they reached the small town of Santa Fe, they met with the allies Daniel had secured, men who were just as tired of the syndicate's reign as Caleb was. They were rough men, hardened by the West, but there was a shared sense of determination in their eyes. They knew what was at stake. They knew that if Carrington wasn't stopped, the West would continue to fall into the hands of men like him. Men who cared nothing for the land, for the people, only for power. Together, they formulated their plan. They would strike Carrington's operation at its weakest point, his supply lines. Caleb and the bounty hunters would hit the warehouses where Carrington stored his goods, disrupting his flow of resources. Meanwhile, Daniel and the others would strike at his enforcers, taking out his men one by one. It would be a calculated, surgical strike, a blow to the heart of the empire. The night before the attack, Caleb stood alone in the barn, looking out over the land. The dogs were quiet now, their bodies resting after a long day of preparation. Caleb's hand rested on the fence, his heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. But there was no turning back. He had fought for too long to give up now. He had been standing alone for far too long. But now, with Daniel by his side, with his allies, and with the dogs, Caleb felt something else, hope. It wasn't over. Not yet. There was still work to be done. As the first rays of light began to break over the horizon, Caleb looked out at the vast expanse of land that stretched before him. The land was his, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it from him. Not Carrington, not anyone. And with that, the final battle began. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow for another special story.